Hello, my friends. I'm George Kors, and today let's talk about Der Tod in Venedig, The Death in Venice by Thomas Mann. I really am excited to talk about this with you folks today, and I want to preface this by saying down below you're going to see a link to my deep dive on Der Zauberberg, which is a gigantic novel by Thomas Mann. And part of what I want to do today is talk about the interconnections between these two texts. Because Der Tod in Venedig came out much earlier than Zauberberg, Magic Mountain. And Death in Venice, when it comes out, is a very popular novella. It's very short and it's very concise. And I want to say for those folks who are out there reading in German, German is your second language, Der Tod in Venedig, Death in Venice is a shorter novella, so it is going to give you the chance to delve into a text that's shorter, and it's very important why, because Der Zauberberg, the Magic Mountain, was imagined as almost sort of a philosophical sequel to the Death in Venice, and these two works are deeply, deeply interconnected. And I think Der Tod in Venedig, the Death in Venice, serves as a really exceptionally worthy introduction to the Magic Mountain. And let me show you my notes in here. Now, Death in Venice focuses on Aschenbach, who is our protagonist here, who is an older sort of intellectual who goes on a trip to Venice and there is scandalized by a young man. And this narrative, in addition to being short and concise, if you're reading in the original German, this narrative gives you a really great introduction into Thomas Mann's syntax. Thomas Mann, in the original German, I cannot speak to the translations for the most part. I've only read one translation of Thomas Mann. Pardon me. Thomas Mann in the original, his language is, his sentences can go on for a long time, and his syntax is quite unique. And his vocabulary is quite unique as well. So if we're looking for that introduction to Thomas Mann and the way that he is as a writer, I think, especially if the goal is to read The Magic Mountain, which it should be, and you should watch the deep dive down below, because The Magic Mountain, I think, is the best coming-of-age novel ever written, in my opinion. If the goal is to eventually read that, I think Death in Venice should probably be the introduction. And the reason why is because our characters here, Aschenbach in The Death in Venice and Hans Castorp in Der Zauberberg and Magic Mountain, both are individuals who are unsure in life, and they take a trip. This is the same condition for both of them. Both of them are having some sort of philosophical or psychological experience that is making them unsure in their current particular position in life, and they take a trip to attempt to resolve some of that, to attempt to resolve some of those feelings. And what goes on the trip is so philosophical, so psychological, so emotional. Both of them have deeply repressed queer feelings. Something that if you are interested in Thomas Mann's biography, also he experiences. Thomas Mann was a closeted bi person, and that is a huge part of Death in Venice, a huge part of Magic Mountain as well. And another aspect of this is that both of them seek knowledge. Both of them are curious about knowledge. Aschenbeck is an intellectual, and Castorp is surrounded by intellectuals at the sanatorium. So we see the very distinct interplay between both of these characters right off the bat. They are both experiencing this. And in Castorp's case, in The Magic Mountain, we're talking about a sort of coming-of-age narrative, which coming-of-age stories are so popular in America right now. They're so popular in young adult literature that I think folks might not realize how complicated a coming-of-age novel can be, because so many of us are reading really superficial YA coming-of-age novels. If that's your thing, if you're coming to Magic Mountain because you know it's a coming of age novel, good for you. You should read it. Get away from those really reductive YA novels. Challenge yourself with something, because we live in a complex world, and complex literature allows us to grapple with that. Gives us a toolkit that better prepares us to grapple with how complicated the world is, right? And the Magic Mountain is really really evocative for me, because it shows just how complicated coming of age can be for an individual. And Death in Venice and Aschenbach's narrative here is sort of the inverse of that. Aschenbach is much older. He's already well past this coming of age, and he's reflecting on life. So he's having this separate kind of evolution where he's reflecting on what's happened through his life, on his feelings about art, his feelings about beauty and love. And that is kind of like almost a reverse coming of age, right? So think about like yin and yang. They're sort of at different ends of the spectrum here. And I think Aschenbach serves as a really great introduction to Castorp, because we start seeing this reflective kind of self-aware and deeply psychological thinking that is going on in the novella here. And I think, for my taste, what connects me, what in my mind connects these two novels are a few different things. First off, we have the condition of travel, of somebody going somewhere for a very discrete amount of time and that turning into more time. This is just how Aschenbach goes. He wants to leave, and then he decides to stay. Castorp goes. He only wants to go for a certain amount of time. He decides to stay. Okay, so both of them have this out of place sensibility to them, and I think in Death in Venice, the backdrop of Venice as a city is really interesting. Because it is such a romantic city. It has such a cultural cachet with Europeans and Americans, and really across the globe now. That we see the protagonist in this particular place out of place. He's not at home. Same thing with Castorp. He goes to the sanitarium to visit his cousin. He is not at home. He is ill at ease because he is not where he is from, where he lives. That's a huge part of both novels. And that also feeds into something that is important here, which is commentary on nationality. And we see that a lot also with Magic Mountain, which is that they're and more so Magic Mountain, but to a large extent in Death in Venice, we see Aschenbach noticing that some individuals are from other countries and commenting on where they are from. And this development of nationality, if you've been around the channel, you've probably heard me recommend Imagine Communities by Benedict Anderson before. Right here. This concept of nationality is something that was developed over a few centuries, and it's been developed at different times in humanity, but in what is being referred to in these novels as being developed over a few centuries in Europe. This is a part of identity that sort of separates out away from religion, this national identity. And that is an important part of both of these novels. And I think that is clear in Death in Venice. Another thing that's really important here is sort of an object of fascination and love that both experience here. Which is that both have an individual that they fawn over. So these two individuals that they are sort of longing for, these are two pivotal characters in both the novels. In Death in Venice, the object of fixation, is Tadzio, a young Polish man, and in Magic Mountain, it is Madame Chauchat. Now, we do see in Death in Venice how complicated this longing is, how problematic the longing is. This is sort of taxing on Aschenbach's soul, and I think in this novel that's really beautifully done. is showing this artist, this intellectual whose longings are so greatly complicated by how problematic they are. I think that might be something that might translate for a lot of readers, is this ongoing discourse that we have contemporarily about whether or not the artist needs to be a good person. I think personally for me, this is this is sort of a critical thinking task that each individual needs to take on their own. And Aschenbach in Death in Venice and his focus on Tadzio do give us one of those instances to sort of unpack how we consider that morally and ethically. And certainly Aschenbach is having his own issues with that. In to an extent, and Castorp and Magic Mountain is also thinking about this. This is a really deep interrelation between the two novels. I think with Tadzio here, we just see a more outright problematic relationship that is possible there, in the way that Aschenbach thinks about Tadzio as a beautiful individual. I think folks are going to immediately sort of recognize the complications that are going on here, without a doubt, and it's something Thomas Mann intended. And for those of you who know Thomas Mann's biography, you know that there is also a biographical precedent there, which is not necessarily it's not necessary for you to know that reading in the novel, but that is also part of it. I think one of these further interconnections here is this interconnection of youth and age, and in Death in Venice, we see Aschenbach as much older. He's already a mature person who's lived a lot of life, and Castorp is having trouble finding his own trajectory. Aschenbach has already had that trajectory. In fact, his trajectory perhaps has already met its arc. Has probably also met its zenith, as we may say. And I think Aschenbach is a character in that way that we're looking for the inverse of Castorp and how we might read these two works together, is really interesting. I see so much of Castorp, maybe foreshadowed with Aschenbach. Because we don't necessarily see, the elder Castorp, although he does end up in the sanitarium for several years. Another interconnection between the two is health and sickness. Health and sickness are approached deeply philosophically in the Magic Mountain. It's a huge part of that narrative. What constitutes healthiness? What constitutes sickness? How psychology affects health and sickness? That is a huge, philosophical aspect of that narrative. And we also see some of that here, because in Death in Venice, essentially a plague breaks out in Venice while Aschenbach is visiting there, and that what constitutes healthiness versus what constitutes sickness, that is something that I think is an important philosophical journey for the individual to go on. And it's definitely something if you live in the United States, where we have ads for medicine. Not many other countries have ads for medicine like we do. If you live in the United States like that this philosophical discussion between what constitutes healthiness, what constitutes being sick, what constitutes being unhealthy, those are definitely questions that I think a lot of contemporary Americans should probably be reckoning with, and something that is deep in Death in Venice. One last aspect of these novels that I think is important here, is dreams. Dreams really are a pivotal point of both of these. Death in Venice has a very significant dream, and Magic Mountain also has a very famous Schneetraum, like really, really important dream sequence there. And both of them greatly affect the characters. And I think Aschenbach's dream is really a pivotal point here of the text. And some may argue that in Magic Mountain that the Schneetraum is the climax of the novel, that is the peak of the novel. Very possible. Very possible also to consider the dream that Aschenbach has, the climax of this novella. All of these interconnections, to my mind, make Death in Venice a supremely worthy introduction to Magic Mountain. And also, if you're looking for a sort of 1-2 punch for Thomas Mann, if you haven't read much Thomas Mann, or if you haven't read any Thomas Mann and you're interested in and maybe delving in, for those who are reading in German or who want to read German literature, Thomas Mann is one of the most famous. Famously exiled himself in the Second World War, famously did radio speeches against Hitler, and they dropped pamphlets over Germany with Thomas Mann's writing, saying, reject fascism, as he had fled to California during that period. And he was a significantly prolific German writer as well. One who is widely celebrated, and this year is a celebration of his 150th anniversary of his birth, 150th birthday, excuse me. So there's a lot of thinking going on about Thomas Mann still, and is a very important writer globally in addition to German language readers. I think, the complexity of Thomas Mann's syntax and Thomas Mann's language is going to be a pretty significant barrier for a lot of readers. I've talked a lot on the channel about how, in my opinion, contemporary American tastes are that we live in this like post-Hemingway space where our language is so simplistic that it's to our own detriment. And Thomas Mann's sentences can be quite long. If you're reading the original German, especially with Magic Mountain, some of the sentences on here are like 2 or 3 pages long. And Death in Venice is no joke about that. And it is a good introduction to his writing. I've read Buddenbrooks, I've read Dr. Faustus, and Magic Mountain, now Death in Venice. And I would say of all of them, I think Death in Venice is really a great introduction. It's short, it's concise, it lets you dig into the kind of sentences he's using and the kind of vocabulary that he has. Thomas Mann's vocabulary is incredibly rich, and it's not this huge work. Thomas Mann wrote a lot of really long novels. Buddenbrooks is very long. What his debut was a really, really long novel. Buddenbrooks and it also has quite a bit of Plattdeutsch and dialect in there as well. It's very well done. Der Tod in Venedig is a much easier and more approachable start there. And as I've said, it outlines a ton of the themes that are then present in Magic Mountain, which a lot might consider his magnum opus. So if you're, interested in getting into Magic Mountain, I think Death in Venice might be the way to go. And I think generally when it comes to an introduction to Thomas Mann, I think Death in Venice might be the place. It's really beautifully written. It has the sentences that are just like really evocative and beautiful that Thomas Mann writes. And Thomas Mann, like some writers, I think Thomas Mann writes the soul really well. You really come to have an understanding of his characters as individuals in a society, and they feel their soul. And I think Aschenbach in Death in Venice is a really good example of that. Just how reflective that he is as a character is really important. And then once we get on to Magic Mountain, I think Hans Castorp is just a really great character because it shows how complicated our coming of age experience really is for us as individuals. And I think that's really important. Overall, what I would say here is, when it comes to the Death in Venice, it's a short read that is going to allow you to immerse yourself in the complexities of Thomas Mann's writing. And also it's going to ask some really important questions, leave you with some really important questions. What is beauty is, of course, one of them. And how beauty and taboo interact is a big part of this narrative. If you're a fan of Vladimir Nabokov, Nabokov in his later writings was experimenting so much with taboo. Lolita, of course, Ada, of course. We were experimenting in those with the concepts of taboo and what is tabooed. And Thomas Mann does a little bit of that work well ahead of where Nabokov was. And I definitely see in Lolita a significant influence from Death in Venice. Because it does push, Thomas Mann is pushing us to ask those questions of like what is acceptable when we're talking about beauty in another individual, what is acceptable for us and where we find beauty, and that's complicated stuff, and I think it can be more complicated than we give it credit for in our contemporary discourse about it. I think it's one of those things where, you know, Aschenbeck is not intending to necessarily have a problematic relationship here, but he is philosophically thinking about this other person that he probably shouldn't, because Tadzio's so young, and he knows better than to have a relationship with this person that's so young, and it's very controversial, and to see Aschenbeck go through this is really really complicated. I think that aspect of it is kind of unique to Death in Venice, because I think in Zauberberg, that there are these like really complicated feelings of love for Xiaoshat, and Xiaoshat is married, so there is sort of a taboo in that sense, but it's not the sort of same thing as what our guy Aschenbeck is thinking. And Aschenbeck, I think, when it comes down to this, the focus is not necessarily on the taboo as much as it is with Nabokov. So if that's not really your thing, and I respect that, a lot of people don't like necessarily exploring what's going on in Nabokov, because that exploration of taboo can be kind of icky, right? And if that's not your thing, don't worry too much, because it's not necessarily the focus. Yes, this obsession with Tadzio is there, but we're really looking more at rather Aschenbeck and his thinking about who he is and where he is in life, and what being an individual means to him, and what being a fully realized individual means to him. And I think that is what really unites these two novels, and why Death in Venice for me is such a great introduction to the Magic Mountain, is because Der Tod in Venedig is all about this guy who feels the desire to go on a trip, goes on the trip, has a bad time, decides to leave, but something tethers him there, and that's this focus on Tadzio and this obsession with beauty that begins to develop in Aschenbeck. And it's very intellectual. It's very sort of, I guess it's very conceptual. So that don't worry. There's not, unlike Nabokov's work in Ada or Lolita, there's not necessarily the act of the taboo, more the philosophical consideration of where Aschenbeck is, and then the sort of focus on Tadzio is what leads him to having these sort of complex sort of thoughts and questions and ideas about himself, just like Xiaoshat and also Hans Castorp's queer love as a young child for another boy. Those serve as sort of the things that predicate his exploration of selfhood. And that's what I think, Death in Venice does really well, and also what I think Magic Mountain does so supremely, which is so explore selfhood in that complex and messy way. And I know for a lot of, looking at Thomas Mann, a lot of our stereotype that we might have informed about German culture and German history and German literature is, very buttoned up, very systematic stuff. And that's fine. But what I think, Thomas Mann shows us here in Death in Venice is a really messy psychology. Even though it's really intellectualized, it really is deeply human and deeply messy. Just like in Magic Mountain, we have these almost allegorical characters that come up with regards to European politics at that time. Settembrini is a great example, that represent these sort of intellectual movements, but are also so human in doing so. So, Settembrini and some of the other sort of allegorical characters here in Magic Mountain represent to us this particular mode of thinking, humanism or radicalism, nihilism. There are all sorts of stuff in Magic Mountain, for example. Aschenbeck also does similarly represent to us some of that intellectualism, some of that being of an artist. And then what complicates in both of these novels, and particularly in Death in Venice, is the humanness that is felt by that individual as we are going through their narrative. And I think what's so great is about Death in Venice is its length. Because it's a novella, because it's so short, it really develops those feelings and thinking and those questions much more quickly than the Magic Mountain does. And that's not to the detriment of the Magic Mountain. I think the Magic Mountain is a masterpiece, very good. But again, if you're looking for that introductory material, Death in Venice can be really good. Especially because the major works by Thomas Mann, especially the novels, tend to be really long. Buddenbrooks is really long. Dr. Faustus is really long. The Zauberberg, Magic Mountain is really long. So the novellas are a really apt place for us to look when it comes to engaging in that complexity on a shorter scale. And this is actually not a bad strategy for us to take with complicated writers, is look to something shorter in order to delve into something longer. Now, I think there's a couple exceptions there for me. I think, I talk in the Thomas Mann V video about how I think V is maybe a better introduction for Gravity's Rainbow than Crying of Lot 49 is, but both can be argued. I will say one of the things that is going to lack in your introduction to Thomas Mann's longer works in the Death in Venice is its brevity and how short it is. Now, that is not to say that the sentences are short, because the sentences are going to pack a punch here no matter what, especially if you're reading a lot of contemporary fiction. I think it's going to be a worthy exposure to some longer sentences here. But we don't have the kind of really long ruminations that we have in Magic Mountain here, and that's going to be the biggest trip up possibly if we're transitioning from Death in Venice into Magic Mountain, is that Magic Mountain is so long and has so much going on in it that some of the ruminations that are here are just really, really significant. My copy with the translations in the back, now not every German copy is going to have translations, is 1,002 pages. So it's a significant novel, The Magic Mountain, and my edition of Death in Venice is less than 100 pages. So I think there is something to be said for just prepare yourself for it is a larger scope in terms of the length when we're transitioning away from it. But when it comes to concepts and the way that Thomas Mann writes about intellectualism and art and beauty and a person's place in society, I think Death in Venice is really, really fantastic. And I think also, I've been really interested in these novels lately that challenge our contemporary American reading habits, and that's why I'm really hyping up Magic Mountain so much in this video about Death in Venice, is because I do think that there are items out there that can subvert our contemporary tastes in a really positive way. And I think Magic Mountain does that really well for coming-of-age stories. I see time and time again, especially on socials, people are obsessed with coming-of-age stories. It is an object of fixation that we have. I don't know if it is nostalgia for youth. There's probably some philosophical stuff that we could go into about where contemporary American fixation and obsession about coming-of-age stories is coming from. But, Magic Mountain, I think, serves as that bridge into more serious literature. I mean more seriously, folks, that a lot of that YA stuff is really superficial, and it might be really cathartic for you to read. But, reading a novel like Magic Mountain is going to give you that coming-of-age experience in a new way that is really, really complicated and necessary. That said, I do think also, Death in Venice is kind of the inverse of that. Older person reflecting on life, reflecting on what it means to be who they are, how they got there. This sort of, opposite end of the spectrum of coming of age story, I think, is also really, really worthy. I think maybe if 1,000 pages, I don't know what the English translation is, the most popular English translations of Magic Mountain are in terms of their pagination and how many pages they are, but if that's a little too much to chew off, Death in Venice has those same sort of thinking processes as a coming of age novel. It's just, an older person reflecting on, are they evolving to a new thing, or are they ascending to a different plane, or, however you might want to think that, in life. Are they moving on to a new part of life, a new section of their experience as a person? So I think, that Death in Venice has that there and can serve, again, if you are a person who is really focused on coming of age stories, I think Death in Venice could get you there. It's almost like Aschenbeck is experiencing a secondary coming of age. And one thing I noticed, I will say there are a lot of those, a lot of narratives about like midlife crisis, about quarter life crisis. Those are really popular, or an older person whose worldview is really challenged. Americans like these too, especially in television, where we see an older person who's middle age or older, experiencing sort of the rug being pulled out from under them, whether that be through divorce or just, the death of a spouse or whatever. Those narratives are pretty popular. And if you're into that sort of thing too, Death in Venice, I think might be for you as well, because again, we're having Aschenbach sort of had the rug pulled out from under him. He's not at home. He's in this place with all sorts of other people. He's not speaking necessarily his language all the time. And it can be very difficult to see Aschenbeck in those moments, and it's really honest, and I think it's really beautifully written. So I think Death in Venice, I would recommend this if you haven't gotten into any Thomas Mann yet. I think for me there's two masterpieces of Thomas Mann in The Magic Mountain and Dr. Faustus. I haven't talked about Dr. Faustus yet on the channel. I need to reread it before I do a deep dive on it, because that is a timely and important novel. But I think Magic Mountain is right up there with it, without a doubt, for very different reasons, extremely different reasons. But I might encourage you, if Magic Mountain is on that to be read list, to have Death in Venice be your introduction to it. Let that be the moment that allows you to get used to how Thomas Mann writes, because his writing, particularly if you're reading in the original German, his writing is quite unique. And I also think it's beautiful. If you've been watching the channel, that I'm a sucker for any novel that is exploring sort of the psychology of the soul, or just how complicated it can be to be a person in a society. And Death in Venice does that really beautifully in under 100 pages. I mean, you can't go wrong with that. It's a really nice, can be a really nice, complicated short read for our folks there. So I want to thank you for spending some time with me talking about Death in Venice and talking a lot about Magic Mountain. I know it might be clear to you now that I have basically 1.5 videos entirely about Magic Mountain that I want to encourage you to read it. I'm kind of on a mission to support complicated literature, and I know that complexity is sometimes in the eye of the beholder, but I will say, if you are out there, I've said this on the channel before, I will say it again on the channel, if you're out there primarily reading young adult fiction and coming of age stories, please go to whatever bookstore that you go to and buy a copy of The Magic Mountain and challenge yourself. Be that person that challenges yourself, because I think it is so worth your while. It will really enrich your life to experience these works. I talked in the Dostoevsky video about how the human experience in a certain extent is ubiquitous. We do think of ourselves as individuals. This has never happened before except for to me, and that is true. But what is also true is that these feelings, these emotions, these psychologies and philosophies are things that are common amongst all of us. And that's a complicated thing for us to unpack. And maybe you should watch my Dostoevsky video to hear me talk philosophically about that in great detail. But, The Death in Venice is a really great short novel that's going to allow you to get into that complexity and that messiness of humanity really quickly, and introduce you to Thomas Mann all the while. And just what a masterful sentence writer Thomas Mann is. As a writer, I just have to say, there are a few individuals out there that I am just absolutely smitten with when it comes to their writing, how they craft a sentence. And I will forever be jealous of Thomas Mann and his ability to craft a sentence. The man was just absolutely able to write a sentence like nobody else. And that's a really good thing. And Thomas Mann, when it comes down to it, as a closeted bi person, also speaks very dearly to me. As a bi person, Thomas Mann really, a lot of his writing, particularly in The Magic Mountain, is really important to me. So thank you so much for spending some time with me today, talking about Thomas Mann, talking about The Death in Venice. Go out there, read my novel, talk about my novel, share it on socials. It's the best way to support me. If you like these videos, I am doing it to support myself as a writer, doing it to spread the word as an independent author, published by small presses. Please share my work, buy it for your friends, talk about it with your folks. If you want to find out more about me, you can go to georgekors.com. You can follow me on socials that I may or may not use at gbk7288. And like and subscribe and share my material across the web. Thank you so much for being here with me today. I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a safe and wonderful day. Thanks, folks.